In the middle of the 19th century, the Protestant Archbishop of Dublin wrote a very angry letter to the Provost. And the Archbishop, who was also a visitor of the university, was very upset about a debate which had taken place right here in the dining hall. The debate was organised by the College Historical Society, and it had been inspired by Edmund Burke, and it was a motion on whether members of Parliament should look after the best interests of the country or the best interests of their constituents. And the Archbishop felt that this was a very dangerous topic for young minds to discuss. However, the Provost of the day was a huge supporter of the Hist, so he didn't really give the Archbishop much time. So the Archbishop decided to make his complaint public, and he published a huge article in a major British publication, Bentley's Magazine, and the headline, "Danger of Debating Societies to Young Men." And the Archbishop made a number of points, including number one, that the motion was too deep a subject for students and was likely to generate a habit of talking without thinking. Second, he disliked the idea of students deciding which side won by a show of hands or a shout, and he thought that instead they should appoint a moderator to decide which was the right side of the argument. And third, he didn't like the idea of extempore speeches because he thought that had a very bad effect on students, and he made a number of other criticisms as well. Now, the incoming auditor of the College Historical Society decided to take on the Archbishop in the first meeting of the new academic year, in a meeting that took place here in the dining hall. Now, that was brave in any circumstance, but it was doubly brave because the auditor was a Catholic, and he was the first Catholic to have ever been elected auditor of the Hist. His name was Dennis Coalfields Herron, and he had what I suppose we would call now, he had previous with the Archbishop. Because in 1843, Dennis Coalfields Herron had been prevented from becoming a scholar of the university because of his religion, and he had appealed to the visitors. The visitors had refused to hear the case, so he went to the law courts, and the court issued a writ of mandamus requiring the visitors to hear the case. And the visitors, who included the Archbishop of Dublin, decided against Herron, and he would not be awarded his scholarship. However, Herron's case did have long-standing consequences, and in the 1850s, Trinity did change its rules on scholarship, and they created non-foundation scholars to allow Catholics and other people who wouldn't take the oaths to become scholars. And the tradition of electing foundation as well as non-foundation scholars on Trinity Monday continues right down to the present day. So, the first meeting of the 1846-1847 session, which was held here in the dining hall, was absolutely packed, as everyone wanted to see what Dennis Coalfield Herron would have to say about the arguments of the Archbishop. And Herron addressed a number of points in his address. He talked about, first of all, how his election showed something about the changing nature of life in Trinity. How in the past, perhaps old prejudices would have prevented him from being elected, but now there was a new spirit in the air, and that spirit of the age had meant that students were willing to vote for him. Secondly, he defended extempore speaking, because he said it was so much better for a speaker to be able to deploy their ideas like a well-disciplined army, ready to turn and wheel and assume every form according to the mode of attack and the strength of the assailant. He said that someone with a pre-prepared speech risked marching like a column of undisciplined troops straight ahead, no matter what the enemy, and they could be easily picked off from the side. Herron rejected the idea that a moderator should decide what was the winning side in the debate, because he said that oratory was all about the art of persuasion, and that if the audience did not decide on the winning side, then oratory as an art was dead. As for the charge that students wouldn't understand the motions they were discussing, he said that where else could you discuss the great issues of history except at a university? And he asked, when will we be old enough if we be not now? And the final point that Herron made is, I think, one that was probably the strongest and the one that has relevance right up to the present day, because he pointed out the greatest strength of a debating society, or indeed any student society. He said that it enables students from different backgrounds and different religious and political beliefs to mix with each other, to exchange ideas, to have their prejudices challenged and their worldview transformed. He said that some students came to Trinity and only knew those who came from the same school or county, becoming thus, and I quote, one of a clique, their views all narrowed, their prejudices all confirmed. Instead, he said, by engaging with people from different backgrounds, different religions, different political beliefs, it achieved the enlarging of the mind to an enlightened sympathy with all. The chair of that meeting was the Lord Chancellor of Ireland, who was also the president of the College Historical Society, Joseph Napier. Daniel O'Connell had given him the nickname Holy Joe because he was such a religious and devout man, and that's the origin of the phrase Holy Joe. Well, Joseph Napier was hugely impressed with Herron's speech. And he said, when he was addressing the audience, he said that in all his years, he had never heard a more eloquent or a more powerful address. And I think the College Historical Society has been very lucky in the people that it has had as its president over the years. People like Napier in the 19th century, people like Douglas Hyde and Conor Cruise O'Brien in the 20th century, and now people like David McConnell in the 21st century. The views of Herron were reflected by other auditors throughout that century. Henry O'Hea, another Catholic auditor in the 1860s, said that the great thing about student societies in Trinity is that it allowed the students to move beyond the hostile camps that were formed for us, and meant they could transcend old rancours, old grievances, and old crimes. This was echoed by the greatest scientist, or certainly one of the greatest scientists in Irish history, William Rowan Hamilton, who delighted in attending and chairing meetings of the College Historical Society, and he greatly enjoyed speaking to the students from the chair. And he talked about how the student societies were great at uniting the forces of reason and imagination, and you certainly see that throughout the 19th century. But of course, as we'll see in the next paper and the brilliant work that Dr. John Bowman has done, by the start of the 20th century, Trinity was not a particularly warm place for Catholics. Some of the problems were internal, and it certainly took a while before, a number of years more before they allowed Catholics to become fellows. But some of the problems were external, and you had the opposition of Cardinal Cullen, and then after that, the new Catholic Archbishop of Dublin, William Walsh. And William Walsh said in the 1880s that he was overburdened with work because so much of his time was taken up with trying to find ways to hurt Trinity College. And he kept a list on his desk, and he had that list entitled at the top, "Some Unfortunate Catholics Who Lost Their Faith in TCD." And it was certainly in places like the College's Historical Society where you saw that some of the openness and liberality, which perhaps wasn't always there in the lecture theatre, was there in the discussions of the students. And an incredible generation of people came through the society in the 19th century. I'm currently working on a history of it. For example, Robert Anderson was auditor of the Society. In the 1880s, he was the head of the CID in London, and he was the head of the Jack the Ripper investigations, and he claimed the credit for bringing those murders to an end. He was also, I'm afraid to say, or ashamed to say, he was also the person who played a major part in smearing Charles Stewart Parnell's reputation in the 1880s in those famous Parnellism and crime articles, but that's perhaps a story for another lecture. I will end at the turn of the century because in 1902, Winston Churchill came to speak to the College Historical Society, and he addressed the students from this very dining hall. And he gave a very wide-ranging address, but afterwards when he was talking to the students, he talked about how that how student societies and societies like the HIST, the society which had helped his father Randolph Churchill come to prominence as an orator 20 years earlier, that it was in these kinds of student societies where you could have a real exchange of ideas, where you could have a real transformation in thinking, and it's where you could generate new thinking about the problems of Ireland. And he predicted that it was in societies like the ones that used to meet here in the dining hall that perhaps one day soon the future of Ireland and the problems of Ireland would be solved.
I think if ghosts smile, probably Dennis Herron is smiling somewhere with that splendid talk. Thank you indeed. Now, I think we enter the 20th century finally, and it would be impertinent really of me to feel that our next speaker needs any introduction to this audience. He is a national treasure. But I just want to put on record that we are very proud of his ongoing connection with this college and indeed with the departments of history and politics, and his connections go back a very long way. So we're really very excited to be able to get him back to talk on subjects such as this, towards the history of Trinity in the 20th century. Some questions. John.